As the great age of Irish Christianity drew to a close, we find the rise of a new generation in what became known as Christian Northumbria. And the central figure in that story was the Venerable Bede. The extraordinary achievements in Northumbria, which stretched from Scotland down the northeast coast of England, whose centre at the monastery of Lindisfarne, is breathtaking. For example, we find here a page from Bede's ecclesiastical history of the English people in a manuscript from the 8th century. Over here from the Lindisfarne Gospels, extraordinarily beautiful achievement, the Gospel of Mark, here with the lion. We will come to the story of St. Cuthbert, here in a 10th century representation with King Athelstan. All of these belong to a story of a great time in Christianity, not only in Britain, but to the revival of Christianity in the north. And we shall see that in the figure of Alcuin, who went from York to the court of Charlemagne. But let's think about Bede. He was born in 673 on monastic grounds at Wearmouth in northeast England. And he was to become one of the great biblical interpreters or commentators of his age. He lived in a Benedictine house in Jarrow, but he never held office. He preferred to stay as a teacher, as an instructor, and his influence over others was extraordinary. He also traveled very little, often only to the monastery at Lindisfarne to gather manuscripts and to teach and engage with monks. He went down to York, where there was a cathedral school. He became eventually a deacon and a priest. But it was the story, we should remind ourselves, begins with another person, Benedict Biscop, who made Wearmouth, Jarrow, the intellectual capital of Northern Europe. He had traveled extensively through Europe and Italian lands and brought back to England the Roman liturgy and made and trained his monks in its performance. There was about 600 monks at the double monastery of Wearmouth, Jarrow. And thanks to Biscop, it became one of the great libraries of its age. And there, the task of copying Bibles was undertaken, 3 of which were beautifully prepared and given to the monastery and 1 for the Pope. These Bibles, such was the achievement that they required approximately the skins of 1,500 calves. Nevertheless, Bede grew up and lived on the periphery of the Christian world. But at that periphery, because of the tradition at Wearmouth, Jarrow, he had access to a great library and was able to dedicate himself to a life of scholarship. He became, at a young age, a talented Latinist. He knew Greek and, unusually for his age, some Hebrew. The range of his writings were remarkable, nothing less than remarkable. He prepared a Latin dictionary, an encyclopedia of natural phenomena, and even a work on the computation of Easter. But without doubt, his greatest achievement was on the Bible. His 25 volumes on the Old and New Testament. He summarized the learning of ages past. He venerated the great fathers of the church, Ambrose, Jerome, Augustine, Gregory, naming them the 4 doctors of the church, or of the Western Church. He translated part of the Bible into English. Although he is remembered as a great biblical commentator who later appears in Dante's Divine Comedy, it was his work as a historian for which we know him best. It was a life that included the saints such as Biscop and Cuthbert. In these figures, he created images of monastic holiness. Bede wanted to show that the Anglo-Saxon world had its own saints. And so he wrote the ecclesiastical history of the English people, which he completed in 731. It tells a very long work. It tells of the triumph of the gospel through the saints, such as Aidan, but as well through the conversion of the kings to Christianity. The theme of the work is evident in his preface. I formerly, he writes, at your request, most readily sent to you the ecclesiastical history of the English nation, which I had lately published, for you to read and judge. And I now send it again to be transcribed and more fully studied at your leisure. And I rejoice greatly at the sincerity and zeal with which you only diligently give ear to hear the words of Holy Scripture, but also industriously take care to become acquainted with the actions and sayings of the former men of renown, especially of our own nation. For if history relates good things of good men, the attentive hearer is excited to imitate what is good. Or if it recounts evil things of wicked persons, none the less the conscientious and devout hearer or reader, shunning that which is hurtful and wrong, is more earnestly fired to perform those things which he knows to be good and worthy of the service of God. And as you have carefully marked this, you are desirous that the said history should be more fully known to yourself and to those over whom the divine authority appointed you, from your great regard to the common good, but to the end that I may remove all occasion of doubting what I have written, both from yourself and from other readers or hearers of this history. I will take care briefly to show you from what authors I chiefly learned the same. A great achievement of Bede was the manner in which he brought together the Roman and Celtic tradition. A major theme in his history was the confrontation between Celtic Roman missionaries and their different practices. Yet through characters such as Cuthbert, there was much admiration for the rigor of the Celtic tradition, even though Bede himself was a passionate supporter of the Roman rites. Cuthbert lived from 636 to 687. He was born to missionaries from Ireland in Northumbria and received an ascetic training at Melrose and followed Eata, the Irish evangelist, to Northumbria, to the monastery of Lindisfarne. Cuthbert would himself become Bishop of Lindisfarne in 685. But there it did not go very well, and he retreated to an island off the coast of Northumbria. When he was found by his fellow monks, his body was emaciated and his feet ulcerated. But his body, and this is central to the life of Cuthbert written by Bede, became the focus of attention. When the Vikings attacked, it was found to be intact after his death, when the monks returned and found him. They took his body and carried it around the kingdom for 7 years. It was the object of great veneration and attracted pilgrims. The body finally ended up in Durham, a cult that would be destroyed in the reforms of Henry VIII. In his life of Cuthbert, a representation of which we see here, Bede tells the story of the uncorrupted body. He writes, "Now divine providence, wishing to show to what glory the holy man was exalted after death, who even before death had been distinguished by so many signs and miracles, inspired the minds of the brethren with a wish to remove his bones, which they expected to find dry and free from his decayed flesh, and to put them on a small coffer on the same spot above the ground as objects of veneration to the people. This wish they communicated to the holy bishop Eobert about the middle of Quadragesima, and he ordered them to execute this on the 20th of April, which is the anniversary of the burial. They accordingly did so, and opening the tomb, found his body entire, as if he was still alive, and his joints were still flexible, as if he were not dead, but sleeping. His clothes also were still undecayed and seemed to retain their original freshness and color. When the brethren saw this, they were so astonished that they could scarcely speak, or so look upon the miracle which lay before them, and they hardly knew what they were doing. The body became the focus of the great cathedral that would be built after the Norman conquest. The story of Bede, the great scholar, is one of an age of Northumbria that would transform Europe by taking learning back to the continent. Bede would be remembered by Alcuin as one of the great figures of the church. He would, in his work, inspire much of what becomes known of the Carolingian Renaissance, to which we will come. Bede's history gave shape and an understanding to the providential development of the English church. And in his life of Cuthbert, he provided a model of how that world understood devotion to God.